For months, the all-elite wrestling landscape had been painted in muted colors. The vibrancy was gone, the highest pitch missing from the symphony of the squared circle. Her name, Valkyrie, had become the great, unspoken void. They tried to fill it, of course. AEW's corporate machine, relentless and pragmatic, threw every rising star, every promising newcomer into the vacuum she left. They experimented with new main events, tried to forge fresh rivalries, and pushed narratives that were meant to feel epic, but instead felt forced. The commentators spoke with manufactured enthusiasm. The graphics were bright, the music was loud, but the audience knew. Every single fan, from the nosebleed seats to the front row, felt the tremor of her absence. It was the silence a conductor hears when the principal instrument is missing from the orchestra. A beautiful sound, yes, but incomplete. Valkyrie hadn't just been a champion. She was the gravity that held the women's division together. Her hiatus, cloaked in vague rumors of injury, burnout, or a disagreement with management, had calcified into legend. The speculation became the main event on social media. Was she tired? Was she done? Had the pressure finally shattered the unbreakable diamond? They acted like she was just another name, a chapter closed in the vast history book of wrestling. But they were about to learn a terrifying truth. You can try to write around a phenomenon, but you can never truly erase it. The canvas was empty, but the paint was coming. Tonight was supposed to be the coronation of her replacement, a carefully choreographed moment designed to signal the new era, the definitive step beyond Valkyrie's shadow. The current champion, a fierce and technically brilliant competitor, was set to defend her title against a respected veteran. The match itself was excellent, crisp, hard-hitting, a spectacle of athleticism. The crowd was invested, roaring at near falls and chanting the names of the two women in the ring. It was the best show they had put on in months, a night of manufactured success that almost felt real. Backstage, the mood was cautiously optimistic. Management was relieved. The narrative they had fought for was finally starting to stick. The commentators were primed with their scripted lines about the future of the division. The tension was dissipating, replaced by the comfortable, predictable hum of a successful wrestling show. It was a beautiful, calculated illusion of peace. But true drama, the kind that rewrites history, rarely announces itself with a fanfare. It arrives like a sudden, cataclysmic shift in the atmosphere, a drop in the temperature before the storm hits. The champion hit her finishing maneuver. The referee counted. 1, 2. The audience held its breath, ready for the exhale of release and acceptance. But the 3 never came. Instead, the entire arena plunged into black. The comfortable hum died. And in the total, terrifying darkness, a single familiar note began to play. The single note, a low, resonant, almost guttural cello string, hung in the sudden, oppressive silence. It was a sound synonymous with defiance, with reckoning, with Valkyrie. A sound that hadn't been heard in this arena for nearly 9 months. The crowd, which had been loud and reactive just moments before, froze. There was a beat of confusion, then a collective, dawning realization. The cello string repeated, a heart beating in the darkness, growing louder, deeper. Then, from the entrance tunnel, a blinding column of white light cut through the black. It wasn't the usual confetti, strobe lights, or pyrotechnics. It was an industrial-scale smoke machine, churning out thick, rolling fog that swallowed the stage and the ramp. And through that swirling, ethereal mist, a shape began to emerge, slow, deliberate, and undeniable. Her silhouette was instantly recognizable, the signature pose, the dominant shoulders, the lean, almost spectral form. As she reached the top of the ramp, the white light coalesced, illuminating her face. She wore no smile, no welcoming gesture. Her expression was pure, concentrated focus, and the fire in her eyes was not a metaphor. It was a cold, hard, dangerous promise. This wasn't a celebrity return. This was an entity asserting its authority. She took a single, slow step forward. The cello note hit a crescendo, and the sound of the crowd, the true, raw, organic sound of the AEW faithful, exploded like a shockwave. The sound was not a cheer. It was a physical force. People were on their feet, their screams melding into a primal roar that shook the very foundations of the building. Hats, signs, and even popcorn flew into the air. Grown men and women were weeping, laughing, and shouting her name, not just out of excitement, but out of a profound, emotional relief. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment that validated their collective belief that the missing piece of the puzzle would eventually slot back into place. Valkyrie stood at the top of the ramp, completely motionless, letting the sheer force of the reaction wash over her. She didn't have to speak. The crowd was speaking for her. They were articulating the 9 months of resentment, the frustration with the manufactured narratives, and the loyalty that had never wavered. Down in the ring, the 2 tired competitors who had just delivered the match of the night were forgotten. The current champion, who had been seconds away from a triumphant defense, stood with her mouth open, the newly minted title belt suddenly feeling like a cheap prop. The veteran looked relieved, almost reverent. This wasn't just a return, it was a cultural reset. The shockwave of the audience's eruption wasn't just noise, it was a declaration. A warning to the locker room, to the management, and to everyone who had profited from her absence. The Queen had walked back into her kingdom, and she was not here to negotiate. The shockwave that hit the arena floor registered immediately in the sterile, soundproofed offices backstage. The executive producer dropped his headset. The head booker buried his face in his hands. The air was thick with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. They hadn't authorized this. They hadn't known about this. Valkyrie's return was an unsanctioned, unscripted detonation that ripped through months of careful planning. The official line had been that she was still under contract, but simply taking time off. The quiet truth was that her contract had complex clauses regarding creative control, and she had exercised her right to disappear. Management had calculated that a 9-month absence would cool the temperature, that the audience would move on, and that they could renegotiate her return on their terms. They were wrong. Now the ratings were spiking. The social media mentions were breaking every internal record. But the control they desperately craved was gone. The chaos of her return proved that she, not the corporation, held the true power. One executive frantically demanded security stop her, to cut the music, to get someone, anyone, to restore order. But the head booker simply shook his head, a grim smile playing on his lips. "You can't stop a storm," he muttered, watching the feed where Valkyrie was now slowly descending the ramp. "You just try to build a stronger shelter." The official plans for the next 6 months were now scrap paper. The future of the entire women's division, and perhaps the company, was resting entirely on the uncompromising gait of one woman. In the women's locker room, the sound of the crowd was muffled, yet entirely unmistakable. The initial reaction was a unified, stunned silence. Then the silence fractured into a dozen different emotional responses. For the newcomers, the young talent who had only heard the whispered legends, there was awe, a terrifying realization of the benchmark they were now expected to meet. For the mid-card talent, who had been working diligently in the shadow of the void, there was a weary sigh of resignation. They knew their push, their careful climb up the ladder, was now paused, perhaps indefinitely. Valkyrie was a solar eclipse, and they were the stars that would disappear when she shone. But the most visceral reaction came from the women at the top, the current champion and her inner circle. The champion slammed her fist into her locker, the shock replaced by a furious, wounded pride. She hadn't just been upstaged. She had been fundamentally delegitimized. 9 months of grinding work, of main events and press conferences, had been reduced to an asterisk by a woman who hadn't laced up her boots in almost a year. A veteran, someone who had battled Valkyrie dozens of times, leaned against the wall and simply smiled. "I pity them," she said, nodding toward the champion. "Valkyrie doesn't come back for money or fame. She comes back to take back what's hers. This wasn't a return. This was an eviction notice." The locker room knew the truth. The division wasn't about titles or win-loss records anymore. It was about survival in the path of a natural disaster. The media reaction was not a wave. It was a deluge. Within 60 seconds of the spotlight hitting her face, the phrase "Valkyrie returns" was the #1 trend globally, burying every news story, political development, and celebrity drama. It wasn't just the wrestling media, it was everyone. Financial analysts were commenting on the immediate spike in AEW stock. Mainstream sports journalists, who rarely covered the dramatic art of wrestling, were writing breathless articles comparing her return to the most iconic moments in sports history. The conversation wasn't about why she was back, but about the sheer gravitational pull of her presence. The media quickly fractured into two camps. The first celebrated her as the defiant icon, the woman who proved that true star power transcended corporate control. She was painted as the hero who had abandoned her throne but returned to reclaim it from the pretenders. The second camp, more cynical and business-oriented, focused on the immediate pressure now placed on her. Could she possibly live up to the hype? 9 months away is an eternity in an athletic career. Ring rust is real, and the narrative pressure cooker had been turned up to an impossible heat. Every move she made, every promo she spoke, would now be dissected and compared not just to her current peers, but to the myth of Valkyrie she herself had created. She was no longer just wrestling for a title. She was wrestling against her own legacy, against the impossible, perfect image the fans had stored in their hearts during her absence. While the arena was still vibrating with the crowd's energy, the shockwave of her return was felt most intimately and most quietly, far from the spotlight. Her family, the few people who saw the woman behind the warrior, watched the broadcast in stunned silence. For them, her absence had not been a wrestling storyline. It had been a period of fragile, necessary peace. The pressure of being Valkyrie, the travel, the injuries, the constant performance of intensity, had taken a heavy toll. Her break had been a chance for them to reconnect with the daughter, the sister, the friend. They had seen her relax, heal, and find a measure of quiet contentment that the wrestling world would never allow. They understood the drive, the innate need she possessed to compete and dominate. But they had hoped the allure of the simple life might finally outweigh the intoxicating pull of the arena. When the lights went out and the cello began to play, their hearts sank, not in anger, but in profound worry. They knew what this meant. The quiet woman they had rediscovered was gone, replaced once more by the magnificent, destructive persona. The cheers were loud, but to her mother, they sounded like a countdown to another painful departure. The media could talk about legacy and money, but her family saw the cost, the sacrifices, the pain, and the relentless emotional toll of carrying the entire emotional weight of a division on her shoulders. Her return was a victory for the fans, but a complicated loss for the people who loved the woman more than the storm. Valkyrie finally reached the ring. She didn't sprint, she didn't pose on the turnbuckle, and she didn't utter a single word. She simply stepped between the ropes, an uninvited force of nature in a space that no longer belonged to her, yet was utterly defined by her. The entire production, the crowd, the cameras, the commentary, froze, waiting for her move. She looked neither at the defeated challengers nor the distraught champion. Her eyes were fixed on the women's championship belt, which the champion still clutched tightly. The champion, shaking off her shock, finally stepped forward, anger overriding fear. She raised the belt defiantly, shouting something unheard over the roar of the crowd. Valkyrie didn't flinch. She slowly raised her right hand and pointed, not at the title, but at the champion's own face. It was a gesture of utter dismissal, a silent declaration that the belt was irrelevant. It was merely a temporary accessory she would soon reclaim. It was the champion herself who was the target, the one who had dared to stand in her place. Then, Valkyrie lowered her hand, turned her back on the furious champion, and walked slowly to the corner. She climbed the turnbuckle and raised both arms above her head, her face a mask of triumphant, yet chilling intensity. The crowd reached its absolute fever pitch. As she jumped down, she paused, and her eyes briefly connected with a camera. In that split-second look, the world understood. This wasn't a challenge. It was an execution. She didn't stay long. Having delivered her warning, having shattered the illusion of stability, Valkyrie exited the ring the same way she had entered. Slowly, deliberately, and without a word. The crowd remained on its feet, a mixture of adrenaline and confusion hanging in the air. The commentators struggled to regain control of the narrative, trying to piece together the chaotic fragments of the last 15 minutes. But the moment had already passed into legend. It was more than a viral wrestling clip. It was a profound, human statement. The surface-level drama was about a wrestler reclaiming her spot, but the deeper meaning was about the inescapable nature of one's true calling. The twist, the true depth of the moment, was not in the fury of her return, but in the emptiness of her eyes. She hadn't walked back in like a storm because she wanted to. She walked back in because she had to. For 9 months, she had tried to be the quiet woman, the person who could simply walk away. She tried to find happiness in the silence, but the silence had only highlighted the hole in her soul where the roar of the crowd belonged. She was not a person who chose the stage. She was a person chosen by it. Her legacy wasn't built on wins and losses, but on the inability to exist without the blinding white light and the smoke. The warning she delivered was not just for the competition. It was for herself. It was the crushing realization that she was permanently defined by the spectacle, unable to fully escape the magnificent, all-consuming fire that was Valkyrie. The lights came back up, a harsh, almost blinding brightness after the cinematic drama of the darkness and the smoke. The current champion stood in the ring, the title belt now hanging loosely in her hand, the adrenaline of her almost victory completely evaporated. She was alone, staring at the empty ramp. The chaos had passed, but the consequences were now settling in like dust after an earthquake. This was the untold story of the night, the emotional aftermath that the highlight reel would never capture. On social media, the clips were already looping endlessly. Memes were created. Legends were born. The wrestling world was officially on fire, exactly as the executives had secretly hoped, despite their panic. Yet, the price of this momentary success was the complete instability of every existing storyline. The narrative was no longer being written by the boardroom. It was being dictated by the whims of a single powerful figure. This wasn't a business plan. It was a high-stakes gamble on the emotional durability of a prodigy. But let us focus for a moment on the woman who was Valkyrie, now sitting in the back of an unmarked black car speeding away from the arena. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't calling her agent. She was simply staring out the window at the anonymous streetlights flashing past. The roar of the crowd, which had been so deafening moments ago, was now a receding echo in her ears, leaving behind a familiar, hollow sound. The twist, the deeper meaning of her return, lies in the fundamental difference between power and peace. She walked back in like a storm, because power, the kind she wielded, doesn't ask permission. It simply asserts itself. But the peace she had chased for 9 months was not found in her absence. It was found to be completely unattainable. She had achieved the impossible. She had stepped away from her own greatness, and in doing so, she discovered that her greatness was not a job she could quit, but an intrinsic, inescapable part of her identity. She hadn't returned for the gold, or the glory, or even to spite the people who tried to replace her. She returned because the weight of her own potential, the unused fire inside her, had become a heavier burden than the pressure of performance. The crowd saw fire in her eyes. Her family saw a terrible magnetic necessity. She was a masterwork, and a masterwork cannot stay hidden in an attic. It must be displayed, even if the light of the gallery threatens to burn down the house. Her return was a warning indeed. A warning to the competition that the Queen was back, but more poignantly,